How did Babylon, one of the most legendary cities in human memory, rise from an obscure settlement to dominate the ancient Near East? And how did it later fall so dramatically that only myths and ruins survived? To answer these questions, we have to follow Babylon's story from its quiet beginnings on the Mesopotamian plain all the way through its imperial triumphs and final decline. Babylon stepped onto the historical stage surprisingly late compared to its powerful neighbors. Around the late 4th millennium BC, a modest settlement grew on a stretch of land nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates. At first, it was nothing more than a small town surrounded by larger, more influential Sumerian and Akkadian cities. Yet what Babylon lacked in early prestige, it made up for with geography. Positioned at the crossroads of irrigation canals and caravan routes, and resting precisely on the boundary between two cultural worlds, Sumer to the south and Akkad to the north, the site possessed all the hidden ingredients for future greatness. The very name Babylon reflects this liminal character. The Greek Babylon comes from the Akkadian Bab Ilim, meaning gate of God. That term traces even further back to the Sumerian Ka Dingir Ra, which carries the same meaning. These layered translations reveal something deeper. Long before Babylon became a center of power, ancient people already sensed a sacred quality in its location, a place where the divine could enter the world of men. The first concrete references to Babylon appear during the final years of the Akkadian Empire, under the reign of Shar-Kali-Shari, the great-grandson of Sargon the Great. At that time, however, Babylon was little more than a provincial settlement. After the empire collapsed, the third dynasty of Ur, one of the last great Sumerian states, absorbed Babylon into its administrative network. Officials were sent to manage the area, but Babylon itself still played no decisive political role. That would change slowly and painfully. By the late 21st century BC, the third dynasty of Ur fell apart under pressure from two directions: Amorite tribes from the north and Elamite forces from the east. In 2004 BC, the Elamite king Kindatu sacked Ur, toppling the last Sumerian kingdom and plunging Mesopotamia into fragmentation. City-states re-emerged: Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, Nippur, each vying for dominance over land, canals, and trade. It was a chaotic world of shifting alliances and competing ambitions. Chaos, however, created opportunity. In 1894 BC, the Amorite leader Sumu Abum seized Babylon and declared its independence. This event marked the true beginning of Babylon's political life. Yet even then, Babylon was far from a regional superpower. It remained relatively small compared to the established giants of southern Mesopotamia, particularly Larsa and Isin. But unlike many cities whose power flared and faded in a generation, Babylon possessed two advantages that would eventually reshape the region: a capable administrative system inherited from Ur III and a geographically strategic location that tied together multiple cultural and economic zones. Over the next century, Babylon's Amorite rulers steadily strengthened the city. They fortified its walls, expanded irrigation works, and cultivated diplomatic ties. It was still in the shadows, but it was growing. Everything changed in 1792 BC. That year, Hammurabi, the sixth king of the first Babylonian dynasty, ascended the throne. When Hammurabi began his reign, Babylon was hardly a dominant force. Southern Mesopotamia remained divided among competing powers. Larsa ruled the richest farmlands. Eshnunna controlled the northeastern trade routes. Mari held sway along the middle Euphrates, and Assyria was beginning to rise in the north. Babylon was stable but not yet influential. Hammurabi understood that lasting power required strong foundations. In the early years of his rule, he focused on internal development rather than expansion. He repaired and extended irrigation canals, crucial for agriculture in Mesopotamia. He reorganized taxation and provincial administration. He strengthened the judicial system and reinforced the authority of the crown. These reforms might have seemed unglamorous, but they created the economic engine and administrative backbone that would enable Babylon's future rise. Then, around 1763 BC, Hammurabi shifted from consolidation to conquest. His first major victory came against Larsa, which he defeated along with the key cities of Uruk and much of the south. With Larsa's fall, Babylon became the undisputed leader of southern Mesopotamia. Hammurabi then turned eastward. Eshnunna, long independent and connected to Elam, fell in 1761 BC. The kingdom of Mari resisted, but eventually suffered the same fate. Hammurabi's forces captured and plundered the city, incorporating its territory into the expanding Babylonian state. By the end of his campaigns, Hammurabi ruled an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Middle Euphrates. Babylon was no longer a provincial capital. It had become the political, economic, and religious heart of Mesopotamia. This transformation reshaped the spiritual world as well. Hammurabi elevated Marduk, Babylon's patron god, to the supreme position in the Sumerian Akkadian pantheon. The king of Babylon was now presented as Marduk's earthly representative, carrying out the divine will on earth. This fusion of politics and theology would shape Babylonian kingship for centuries. But Hammurabi's reforms went deeper than administration or religion. He oversaw a society divided into three major classes: the Awilim, free citizens with legal protections; the Mushkanim, dependent laborers with limited rights; and the Wardim, slaves with virtually none. It was a hierarchical world, but one governed, at least in theory, by law. And that law was codified in the most iconic legal document of the ancient Near East, the Code of Hammurabi. Carved onto a black diorite stele, the code touched on nearly every aspect of life: contracts, property, agriculture, trade, crime, family, and labor. Though punishments varied by social class, the code also included protections for widows, orphans, and tenant farmers. In its prologue, Hammurabi claimed he received these laws from Marduk to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak. Whether or not this ideal was realized, the symbolism of the code helped define royal authority as a force above private interests, an innovation that shaped Mesopotamian governance long after Hammurabi's reign ended. Yet even at the height of its glory, Babylon's image was already undergoing transformation. Centuries later, Greek and biblical writers would portray the city as a place of decadence, excess, and sinful luxury. Herodotus famously described a practice known as temple prostitution, claiming every woman in Babylon had to offer herself once in the temple of Ishtar. Modern scholarship, however, reveals no archaeological evidence for such rituals. Most scholars now view these stories as exaggerations or misunderstandings, myths born from cultural bias rather than historical reality. Still, the myth of the Whore of Babylon would endure, shaping Western imagination for millennia. After Hammurabi's death in 1750 BC, the empire he built began to unravel more quickly than anyone could have imagined. His son, Samsu-Iluna, inherited a vast realm, but not the conditions that had made its creation possible. Hammurabi's long campaigns had stretched the economy thin, and the administrative unity he forged depended heavily on his personal authority. Without his presence, the Babylonian state soon revealed deep fractures. On the surface, Babylon still looked strong, its cities fortified, its bureaucracy intact, its prestige unmatched. But underneath this facade lay rising discontent. The southern cities, especially Uruk, Isin, Larsa, and Nippur, rebelled repeatedly. These regions had long traditions of independence, and had been integrated into the empire only through military pressure. Samsu-Iluna, lacking his father's military brilliance, struggled to contain the unrest. One by one, southern territories slipped from Babylon's control and drifted toward autonomy. At the same time, trouble brewed in the north. Assyria, which had been subordinate to Babylon during Hammurabi's later years, steadily regained strength. And from the Zagros Mountains came newcomers who would profoundly shape Babylon's future: the Kassites. At first appearing as mercenaries and raiders, the Kassites gradually settled in northeastern Mesopotamia. They built strongholds, forged alliances, and slowly embedded themselves within Babylon's political landscape. Their growing influence hinted at major changes to come. The centuries following Hammurabi are some of the murkiest in Babylonian history. The names of several kings are lost, records thin out, monumental inscriptions become rare. This absence of evidence speaks volumes. It reflects a period of fragmentation, economic strain, and political weakness, conditions that left Babylon vulnerable to external forces. Around 1595 BC, a dramatic event struck the city. The Hittite king Mursili I launched a sudden raid into Mesopotamia. Sweeping south with unexpected speed, he stormed Babylon and destroyed what remained of the old Amorite dynasty. Mursili did not stay to rule. After looting the city, he withdrew to Anatolia. But the impact was enormous. Central authority collapsed, the administrative system fell apart, temples burned, and fields lay ruined. Babylon was left in political limbo, its throne empty, its future uncertain. Into this vacuum stepped the Kassites. Unlike the Hittites, the Kassites did not destroy what remained. Instead, they carefully integrated themselves into Babylonian culture. They adopted the Akkadian language, worshipped Babylonian gods, and maintained the existing administrative structures. This strategy worked. Over time, the Kassite dynasty became the longest-lasting in Babylonian history, ruling for more than 4 centuries, from the mid-16th to the 12th century BC. Their reign brought stability, agricultural revival, and significant diplomatic presence. The Kassite period coincided with an era of international connectivity known as the Late Bronze Age world, when great powers, Egypt, the Hittites, Mitanni, Assyria, and Babylon, exchanged gifts, letters, and royal marriage proposals. The surviving Amarna letters reveal Babylonian kings speaking to Egyptian pharaohs as equals, addressing them as brother. Such correspondence underscores Babylon's status during this time as a major player on the world stage. Still, the Kassites could not hold power indefinitely. By the late 13th century BC, Assyria had recovered and was pushing aggressively into Babylonian territory. During the reign of the Kassite king Kassite IV, the Assyrian monarch Tukulti-Ninurta struck a decisive blow. Around 1225 BC, he captured Babylon, seized its treasures, and carried off members of the Babylonian aristocracy. He even deported Kassite IV to Assur. For the first time, Babylon fell to Assyria, but Assyrian rule proved short-lived. Shortly after assuming the Babylonian throne, Tukulti-Ninurta was assassinated in a political coup. Chaos in Assyria allowed the Kassites to recover the city, though their power was permanently weakened. The final catastrophe came in 1155 BC, when Shutruk-Nahunte of Elam invaded Babylon, plundered its temples, and carried off statues of the gods, including the revered image of Marduk to Susa. This act shattered Kassite legitimacy and ended their dynasty once and for all. What followed was a turbulent period. Southern Mesopotamia became a battleground of rival claimants, local dynasties, and external invaders. Assyria, now a rising imperial force, increasingly intervened in Babylonian affairs, sometimes as protector, sometimes as conqueror. Babylon's sacred prestige remained intact, but politically the city was vulnerable as never before. The turning point came with Assyria's explosive expansion under Tiglath-Pileser III in the 8th century BC. His campaigns swept across the Near East, and Babylon fell under his control. Although Babylonian kings were nominally left on the throne, they functioned as vassals. Under Tiglath-Pileser's successors, including Sargon II, Assyrian dominance became more direct. They deposed rulers, suppressed revolts, and installed governors loyal to Assur. The city's breaking point came in the reign of Sennacherib. Babylon had rebelled several times, and Sennacherib, exhausted by its constant defiance, took a course of action that shocked the ancient world. In 689 BC, he ordered Babylon destroyed. His armies leveled its buildings, looted its temples, and even diverted the Euphrates River to flood the city's ruins. This act of devastation was unprecedented. Babylon was not merely another city. It was the spiritual heart of Mesopotamia. Destroying it was akin to tearing out the soul of the region. The response was swift and severe, though not militarily. Assyria itself reacted with discomfort and unrest. Even Assyrians viewed the annihilation of Babylon as a sacrilegious act, an offense against Marduk and against the traditional order of the world. Sennacherib was assassinated not long after, possibly with connections to internal resentment. His successor, Esarhaddon, took dramatic steps to reverse the damage. He rebuilt Babylon, restored its temples, and returned the image of Marduk. These acts were not mere diplomacy. They were necessary to restore both religious balance and political legitimacy. Under Esarhaddon, Babylon regained a measure of autonomy, though it remained firmly under Assyrian influence. Upon Esarhaddon's death, the empire faced another critical decision. To prevent conflict between Assyria's two most important cities, Nineveh and Babylon, he divided royal authority between his sons. Ashurbanipal became king of Assyria, while Shamash-Shum-Ukin became king of Babylon. In theory, this arrangement would preserve harmony. In reality, it planted the seeds of civil war. Shamash-Shum-Ukin, raised in Babylonian culture and venerated as its rightful sovereign, soon chafed under his brother's dominance. Assyria still controlled the army, treasury, and foreign affairs, leaving him king in title but not in power. In 652 BC, he launched a grand rebellion, rallying southern cities and forging alliances with Elam, Arab tribes, and other regional powers. But despite the coalition, the revolt failed. Ashurbanipal besieged Babylon, captured the city in 648 BC, and suppressed its autonomy completely. Babylon remained under direct Assyrian rule for decades afterward. Yet Assyria itself was weakening. Constant wars, rebellions, and internal strife drained its resources. After Ashurbanipal's death, the empire fragmented into competing factions. This fracture gave Babylon one last chance. With Assyria collapsing under the weight of its own exhaustion, Babylon finally saw an opening it had not enjoyed for centuries. In 626 BC, a Chaldean leader named Nabopolassar seized the moment. Rallying local support, he expelled the remaining Assyrian garrisons from Babylon and proclaimed himself king. This event marked the birth of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the final and most brilliant chapter in Babylon's long history. Nabopolassar moved quickly to stabilize his rule. He secured alliances among southern cities, mended relations with powerful priestly families, and restored confidence in Babylon's ancient institutions. Yet he knew that lasting independence could only be achieved by dismantling Assyria once and for all. That meant war. Assyria, though weakened, was still formidable. It controlled vast territories stretching from Egypt to the mountains of Iran. But it had two fatal disadvantages: internal fragmentation and powerful enemies surrounding it. Nabopolassar recognized a crucial opportunity, one that would change the fate of the region. To the east, the Maids, under King Kyaxares, were rising as a major power. Their interests aligned perfectly with Babylon's. Both sought to break Assyria's hold over the Near East. Thus, around 615 BC, a Babylonian-Median alliance was forged, one of the most consequential military pacts of the ancient world. Their joint campaign began swiftly. In 614 BC, the Medes captured Ashur, the old Assyrian capital. 2 years later, in 612 BC, Babylonian and Median forces converged on Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian Empire. The siege was brutal. Ancient accounts describe burning towers, collapsing walls, and entire districts consumed by flames. When the city finally fell, Sinshar-ishkun, the last great Assyrian king, perished in the fighting. The destruction of Nineveh was so complete that the city would never again rise as a major urban center. Assyria did not die immediately. Remnants of its army regrouped at Haran under Ashur-uballit II. But the empire was broken beyond repair. Within a few years, it vanished entirely from the political map, ending one of the longest and most powerful imperial traditions in ancient history. From those ruins, Babylon emerged once again as the leading power of Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar's reign represented the rebirth of Babylon as an independent and dynamic force. He consolidated territories from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, restored irrigation systems, revived temple complexes, and reinforced the city's status as a religious center. Yet it was his son who would elevate Babylon to an unprecedented level of splendor and historical renown. In 605 BC, after Nabopolassar's death, the throne passed to Nebuchadnezzar II, perhaps the most famous king in Babylonian history. The timing was dramatic. Nebuchadnezzar immediately inherited the Assyrian conflict. At the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC, he crushed the remaining Assyrian-Egyptian forces, ensuring Babylonian supremacy over Syria and the Levant. This victory cemented his status even before he reached Babylon to claim the crown. Over the next decades, Nebuchadnezzar campaigned tirelessly across the Near East, reinforcing Babylon's authority. He subdued rebellious cities, secured trade routes, and extended Babylonian influence deeper into the Levant than any king before him. His most significant military action occurred in the Kingdom of Judah. In 597 BC, he besieged Jerusalem, deposed King Jehoiakim, and deported the elite of Judah to Babylon. A few years later, after Judah revolted again under King Zedekiah, Nebuchadnezzar returned with overwhelming force. In 586 BC, Jerusalem fell. Solomon's temple, the spiritual heart of the Jewish people, was destroyed, the palace burned, and thousands deported. This event, known as the Babylonian captivity, profoundly shaped Jewish identity and theology for centuries. But Nebuchadnezzar was not remembered solely as a conqueror. He was a monumental builder, and under his rule, Babylon became one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. His construction projects were vast and ambitious. At the center of the city stood the Esagila, the Temple of Marduk, magnificently rebuilt and richly adorned. Rising beside it was the towering ziggurat Etemenanki, whose massive, stepped structure reached nearly 90 meters into the sky. Many scholars associate this ziggurat with the biblical Tower of Babel, though its exact form remains debated. Nebuchadnezzar also strengthened Babylon's defenses. He constructed double walls encircling the city, separated by a water-filled moat, with the outer wall reaching nearly 7 meters in thickness. The most famous of his architectural achievements was the Ishtar Gate. Faced with deep blue glazed bricks and decorated with ranks of lions, bulls, and dragons, the sacred animals of Ishtar and Marduk. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, a broad stone avenue lined with lion reliefs, used for ceremonial parades during the New Year festival. And then there were the Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Though their historical existence remains debated, tradition claims Nebuchadnezzar built them for his Median wife, Amytis, who longed for the green mountains of her homeland. Whether real or mythologized, the gardens became an enduring symbol of Babylon's splendor. Nebuchadnezzar reigned for over 40 years. Under his guidance, Babylon reached the zenith of its cultural, economic, and architectural glory. It was a metropolis of extraordinary grandeur, a city of temples, palaces, ziggurats, and markets, the shining jewel of Mesopotamia. Yet even the most magnificent empires are fragile. Nebuchadnezzar's death marked the beginning of Babylon's rapid decline. His successor, Amel-Marduk, ruled only 2 years before being overthrown by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar. After Neriglissar's death, his young son Labashi-Marduk briefly took the throne, but was assassinated soon after. Within just 6 years, Babylon saw 3 kings rise and fall in violent succession. The royal dynasty fractured, the government weakened, and the stability Nebuchadnezzar had built for decades evaporated almost overnight. These internal fractures opened the door for one of the most unusual kings in Babylonian history, Nabonidus. Nabonidus, who came to power in 556 BC, remains one of the most enigmatic figures in Babylonian history. He was not born into the royal line. His origins are debated. Some believe he was a military commander. Others suggest he came from a prominent priestly family. Whatever his background, he ascended the throne through a palace coup, and from the start, his reign broke sharply with Babylonian tradition. His most controversial actions centered on religion. Babylon's political and spiritual identity was inseparable from the worship of Marduk, the city's patron god. Every year during the New Year festival, the king had to participate in sacred rituals affirming his divine mandate. But Nabonidus deviated dramatically from this custom. He elevated the moon god Sin, the deity of Haran, to unprecedented prominence. He funded Sin's temples, composed hymns in his honor, and even issued inscriptions portraying Sin, not Marduk, as the supreme god. Such a shift was more than theological preference. It struck at the very foundation of royal legitimacy. The priesthood of Marduk, among the most powerful religious officials in Mesopotamia, viewed Nabonidus's reforms with alarm. His policies threatened their influence and violated centuries of sacred tradition. And then he made a decision that pushed Babylon into a crisis from which it could not fully recover. He left. Instead of ruling from the capital, Nabonidus abandoned Babylon and relocated to Tema, an oasis in northern Arabia. He stayed there for nearly 10 years. The reasons remain mysterious. Some scholars propose that Tema offered control over lucrative caravan routes. Others argue he was escaping political opposition in Babylon. Still others believe he pursued a personal religious mission centered on sin. Whatever the case, his prolonged absence was viewed as a betrayal of both civic duty and divine order. Without the king present to perform sacred rituals, the relationship between Marduk and the monarchy was symbolically severed. In Babylon, real authority passed to his son, Belshazzar, who served as regent. Though remembered in the biblical book of Daniel, Belshazzar was not technically king. Nabonidus retained the royal title. This created an unusual and unstable political situation. Belshazzar had enough authority to govern, but not enough legitimacy to command widespread loyalty. Meanwhile, far to the east, destiny was gathering strength. During Nabonidus's long retreat, the Persian Empire was rising under Cyrus the Great, one of history's most extraordinary conquerors. Cyrus had already defeated Media, subdued Urartu, and toppled Lydia. His military skill, diplomatic acumen, and ability to incorporate conquered peoples into his empire made him a formidable threat. And Babylon, distracted, divided, and leaderless, was the next logical target. By 539 BC, Cyrus made his move. Nabonidus returned from Tama, attempting belatedly to rally his weakened state. But morale was low, the priesthood was hostile, and the army lacked cohesion. The decisive confrontation unfolded near the city of Opis on the Tigris River. Babylonian forces were crushed. Some accounts describe mass slaughter, others speak of a swift collapse. Either way, the outcome was clear. Babylon's military resistance had failed. What happened next has become one of the most famous scenes in Near Eastern history. Babylon did not fall by siege or destruction. It surrendered quietly. Both Babylonian and Greek sources agree. The city opened its gates. Some traditions claim the Persians diverted the Euphrates, entering along the riverbed. Others suggest influential Babylonian nobles, disillusioned with Nabonidus and angered by his religious policies, simply let Cyrus in. Nabonidus was captured. Belshazzar likely perished during the transition, and so, for the first time in nearly 2,000 years of recorded history, Babylon lost its independence. Cyrus entered the city not as a conqueror bent on destruction, but as a liberator. He restored temples, respected local customs, and, crucially, honored Marduk. On the Cyrus Cylinder, often called the world's first charter of human rights, he claimed that Marduk himself had chosen him to rule Babylon. Whether this was political propaganda, religious diplomacy, or genuine conviction, it worked. The priesthood accepted him. The people accepted him. And thus, without fire or bloodshed, the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to an end. Though conquered, Babylon remained important. Under the Achaemenid Persians, it became one of the empire's key administrative capitals. Many kings, including Darius and Xerxes, spent considerable time in Babylon. Royal inscriptions, treasury tablets, and administrative archives from this period attest to the city's continued vitality. Agriculture flourished along the Euphrates. The scholarly tradition of cuneiform writing persisted, especially in astronomy. Babylon remained wealthy, cultured, and influential, but increasingly as a provincial hub rather than the heart of a world power state. Yet the city's symbolic prestige remained immense. Great rulers understood that claiming Babylon meant claiming legitimacy, and no conqueror understood this better than Alexander the Great. In 331 BC, after defeating the Persians at Gaugamela, Alexander advanced on Babylon. The city surrendered without resistance. Almost instantly, he was embraced as king of Babylon, following in the footsteps of Cyrus, who had been welcomed 2 centuries earlier. Alexander treated Babylon with reverence. He began restoring the Esagila and announced plans to rebuild the towering ziggurat Etemenanki, which stood in ruins. Ancient sources say he personally inspected the site and directed its reconstruction, ordering thousands of workers to begin clearing debris. Alexander envisioned Babylon as the capital of his future world empire, an imperial center linking Greece, Egypt, and Asia in one vast cultural synthesis. For a brief moment, it seemed Babylon might rise again, but fate intervened. In 323 BC, Alexander fell ill and died in Babylon at the age of 32. The cause remains debated: malaria, poisoning, overexertion, but his death shattered his empire in an instant. With no clear successor, his generals, the Diadochi, split his territories and plunged the Near East into decades of conflict. Babylon, situated at the crossroads of their rivalries, became a contested prize rather than a flourishing capital. Eventually, the Seleucid dynasty took control. Seleucus I initially used Babylon as an administrative center, but soon he founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris. Modern, planned, and strategically located, the new city drew merchants, administrators, scholars, and skilled laborers away from Babylon. Economic gravity shifted eastward, and Babylon's decline began in earnest. Still, traces of Babylonian culture endured. The temples continued rituals for a time. Scholars kept cuneiform alive for centuries. Astronomers recorded detailed celestial observations, many of which are still used by historians today. But these traditions slowly faded. As populations migrated and shifting river patterns made agriculture more difficult, Babylon's vast urban landscape emptied. By the Parthian period, Babylon was a shadow of its former self, its walls crumbling, its temples quiet, its population dwindled to scattered communities clustered among ancient ruins. Greek and Roman travelers reported seeing desolate streets, fallen ziggurats, and overgrown canals where great kings once marched in procession. The heart of Mesopotamia had turned into a memory, and yet the story was not fully over. Babylon's stones fell silent, but its name continued to grow louder in legend. By the late Seleucid era, Babylon was no longer the vibrant, breathing capital that had once shaped the destiny of empires. Yet its cultural gravity remained so strong that even in decline, rulers understood the symbolic value of being associated with the ancient city. To be accepted in Babylon, to walk its sacred precincts, to honor its gods, was to inherit a slice of legitimacy drawn from millennia of tradition. But symbols cannot sustain a city forever, and the forces of history were slowly tightening around Babylon, pulling it toward its final transformation. Under the Seleucids, the shift of administrative power to Seleucia on the Tigris proved irreversible. Babylon's population steadily drained into the new capital, where the Hellenistic grid layout, fresh markets, and royal patronage offered opportunities the old city could no longer match. The ancient temples of Babylon continued functioning for a time, but their influence waned as new Greek-style civic centers emerged elsewhere. Even the long-standing discipline of cuneiform scholarship, kept alive by priests and scribes, began to wither as the Greek alphabet spread and new intellectual traditions took root. Still, Babylon lingered in a liminal state, not dead, not alive, something between ruin and memory. Then came the Parthians, who seized control of Mesopotamia around the 2nd century BC. Their empire stretched across Iran and Iraq, but they showed little interest in restoring Babylon's former glory. Unlike earlier conquering powers, the Parthians did not attempt to rebuild Babylon's temples or revive its administrative relevance. Their priorities lay elsewhere, and they founded new urban centers like Ctesiphon, which quickly eclipsed Babylon in strategic importance. As political power migrated and trade networks shifted, Babylon's canals began to clog with silt. Agriculture, once the backbone of the city's wealth, suffered. Fields dried, villages relocated. The Euphrates, that ancient lifeline, gradually changed its course, leaving parts of the urban landscape drained and exposed to erosion. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a slow suffocation, an empire's heartbeat fading pulse by pulse. Travelers from the Greek and Roman world who visited Babylon during this era provide haunting descriptions. They wrote of vast, empty courtyards where priests had once performed rituals to Marduk. They described toppled columns, cracked foundations, and the looming silhouette of the ruined ziggurat, once the towering pride of Nebuchadnezzar, now reduced to a sloping mound of rubble. One Roman writer remarked that only the shadow of Babylon remains, as if the city had slipped halfway into another realm. By the 1st century BC, cuneiform, the oldest writing system in human history, was rapidly dying out. The last known astronomical texts in cuneiform date to the 1st century AD, marking the end of a tradition that had endured for more than 3,000 years. With the disappearance of its scribes, Babylon lost not only its language, but also the institutional memory that had defined it for generations. And yet Babylon refused to vanish from the human imagination. Its name had already taken on mythic proportions. For the Hebrew people, whose identity had been forged partly in the fires of exile, Babylon became a symbol of oppression. Biblical writers portrayed it as the archetype of arrogance, decadence, and divine rebellion, the city that defied God, the empire that humbled Israel, the whore condemned in Revelation. Greek authors cast Babylon in their own mold of Eastern exoticism, emphasizing luxury, sensuality, and splendor even in ruin. Later, Christian interpretations transformed Babylon into a metaphor for worldly corruption, a cautionary tale of pride punished by divine justice. These narratives, layered one upon another, detached Babylon from its historical reality and elevated it into the realm of universal symbols. The city became larger in legend than it had ever been in life. Meanwhile, in the physical world, Babylon slipped further into obscurity. When the Sasanian Empire replaced the Parthians in the 3rd century AD, Babylon had already been reduced to scattered settlements. The Sasanians favored cities like Ctesiphon and later Ve-Ardashir. Babylon's temples, now neglected for centuries, decayed beyond repair. Roofs collapsed, walls eroded, and inner sanctuaries filled with wind-blown dust. The ziggurat, once the awe-inspiring Etemenanki, deteriorated into an amorphous mound that travelers could scarcely identify without local guides. And then, in the 7th century AD, when Arab armies swept into Mesopotamia during the early expansions of the Islamic Caliphate, they found Babylon not as a city, but as an echo. The site was already a ruin. Villagers in the region made use of its ancient bricks, still sturdy after thousands of years, to build their homes and walls, unaware that they were dismantling one of history's greatest cities. The name Babylon survived only as a geographic reference, a whispered memory passed down by people who lived among ruins they no longer understood. But even total physical collapse could not fully erase Babylon. The city's afterlife flourished in literature, theology, and collective memory. The story of the Tower of Babel linked Babylon to the human desire to reach the heavens, a mythic monument to ambition. The tale of the Babylonian captivity shaped the cultural identity of the Jewish people. In medieval Europe, artists and theologians invoked Babylon as the ultimate symbol of earthly temptation. In the Islamic world, Babylon became associated with ancient magic and the legendary beings known as Harut and Marut. Across continents and centuries, Babylon's legacy grew even as its stones sank into the earth. Modern archaeology eventually rediscovered the truth beneath the legends. In the 19th and 20th centuries, excavations by European scholars unearthed the foundations of the Ishtar Gate, the processional way, the royal palaces, and the massive perimeter walls. Tablets recovered from the site shed new light on Babylon's administrative systems, religious practices, and scientific achievements. The rediscovery of Etemenanki's remains revitalized debates about the historical basis for the biblical Tower of Babel. Piece by piece, archaeologists reconstructed a more accurate picture of the city. One grounded in material evidence rather than myth, Babylon emerged not as a den of sin or a fantastical wonderland, but as a complex, sophisticated urban center that played a central role in the development of law, astronomy, literature, and empire. Its influence continues to radiate through modern civilization, from legal concepts derived from Hammurabi's Code to astronomical methods pioneered by Babylonian scholars. Yet the city itself never revived. Its fate was sealed by geography, politics, shifting rivers, and the relentless march of time. For more than 2,000 years, Babylon had shaped and been shaped by the world around it. But by the early medieval period, All that remained were ruins, stories, and a name powerful enough to outlast entire empires. Thus, Babylon's story came to its final chapter. Not extinction, but transformation. A city that once ruled the Near East now ruled the realm of memory. A place that disappeared from the world became immortal in the imagination of humanity. Babylon did not die. It transcended. In the end, Babylon's disappearance from the maps did not diminish its presence in the human story. If anything, the city became more powerful after its physical silence. While the bricks crumbled and the canals dried, Babylon's image, polished by thousands of years of retelling, continued to evolve in religious texts, literature, and cultural imagination. Across civilizations, Babylon transformed into something far larger than the ruins that once lined the Euphrates. For Jewish and later Christian writers, Babylon was more than a geographical location. It became a moral symbol, an embodiment of pride and rebellion against the divine. The destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BC, the trauma of exile, and the long yearning for return etched the name Babylon into the spiritual identity of a people. In the Book of Revelation, Babylon the Great appears not as a city, but as a metaphor for human corruption. The historical empire was long gone by then, but the memory had outlasted the walls. In the Greek imagination, Babylon lingered as a land of immense wealth, strange customs, and monumental architecture. Herodotus, though prone to exaggeration, immortalized the city in his writings as a place of wonders, its walls so wide that chariots could pass atop them, its streets alive with splendor. Later authors embellished these images, blending fact and fantasy until Babylon became an archetype of the exotic East. Even in the Islamic tradition, Babylon found new life. The Quranic story of Harut and Marut, two angels who descended in Babylon to test humankind, ensured the city's continued presence in the religious landscape of the Middle East. Many medieval writers associated Babylon with ancient magic and esoteric knowledge, further enhancing its aura of mystery. By the medieval era, the physical site itself had become a destination for curious travelers. They arrived expecting the city of myth, and instead found a desolate sprawl of earth mounds, broken bricks, and scattered pottery fragments. Yet even then, the mythology was so strong that many visitors convinced themselves they were standing before the Tower of Babel, staring at the ruins of a grandeur they could barely imagine. Centuries passed in this quiet decline. The Euphrates shifted. Small villages and fields slowly spread across the ancient site. Locals knew the place only as Babel, unaware, or perhaps uninterested, that they lived among the remains of one of humanity's earliest urban giants. The world moved on, and for a long time, Babylon slept. It wasn't until the 19th century, during the rise of modern archaeology, that Babylon stirred again. European explorers, driven by curiosity, empire, and biblical fascination, began searching the Middle East for the cities of antiquity. The work was slow and difficult. The land offered few clues, and early maps were based more on legend than accuracy. But in time, the outlines of Babylon emerged. Excavators uncovered the foundations of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the lower levels of the Ishtar Gate, and the remnants of the processional way. Thousands of cuneiform tablets surfaced, revealing administrative records, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, and personal letters. Voices of the ancient world suddenly speaking again. Perhaps the most dramatic find came in the early 20th century, when German archaeologist Robert Koldewey uncovered the magnificent blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate. Its reconstruction now stands in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, one of the most stunning artifacts of ancient architecture ever displayed. The discovery confirmed that Babylon's beauty was not exaggerated. Its splendor had simply been forgotten. These excavations brought Babylon back into the global imagination, not as myth, but as history. Scholars no longer relied on Herodotus or biblical authors alone. They had primary records, tablets describing slave contracts, letters between kings, astronomical diaries stretching across centuries, and royal inscriptions celebrating victories and construction feats. Piece by piece, the real Babylon emerged, complex, diverse, innovative, and deeply human. Yet even as the ancient city returned to life through archaeology, its physical remains continued to weather under the sun. Modern conflicts, neglect, and environmental pressures further damaged the fragile ruins. During the late 20th century, attempts were made to partially rebuild Babylon, though these efforts were often controversial. The ancient foundations, after all, were never meant to support modern bricks. Still, the symbolic power of Babylon endures. In 2019, UNESCO designated the site a World Heritage Site, acknowledging its unparalleled historical significance. Today, Babylon stands not only as a ruin but as a reminder of the rise and fall of empires, of human ambition and innovation, of the fragility of civilizations. It is a testament to how societies can shine brilliantly before fading away, only to be reborn in the memories of those who follow. Babylon's story stretches across 2,000 years, from a small settlement at the crossroads of rivers to the capital of Hammurabi's empire, from Nebuchadnezzar's jewel of the ancient world to a conquered province of Persia, from a battleground of Greek generals to a forgotten mound beneath village fields. Few cities have risen so high or fallen so far. Fewer still have remained so powerful in memory after their stones turned to dust. It is a story of power and collapse, of myth and truth, of human resilience and the passage of time. The ruins may lie silent, but the legacy of Babylon lives on, in our laws, our religions, our languages, and our imaginations. Its temples may have crumbled, but its name echoes across cultures and centuries. Babylon once ruled the world. Now it rules something far greater, the collective memory of humankind. Thus ends the full arc of Babylon, a city that rose, fell, rose again, and ultimately transcended mortality through legend. Thank you for watching.